let's talk about daddy issues. Welcome to Sexography. This is going to be our video lecture / vlog number 1. I want to welcome everyone who's here, whether or not you're a student who's forced to listen to this nonsense. You may also be a curious colleague or just an internet lurker who's looking for some open access information, in which case you are welcome. Thank you for being here. So today I want to focus in on the psychosexual stages, kind of give you a brief overview. I don't want this to be a long video, just to touch base and just outline the theory and kind of give a so what to the matter. So if you've already listened to the podcast, I've done a podcast over talk therapy and Freud and kind of outlined some of his basic ideas. But the first thing we need to understand about the psychosexual stages is that Freud conceived of everything that we are as adult humans, we develop in childhood. And so he created a stage theory, and you know how I feel about stage theories, to address the developmental processes of going from infant to functioning adult in society. So for Freud, he was one of the first people to theorize that perhaps we don't come kicking and screaming out of the womb fully formed and alive and who we are meant to be, that there may not be a specific essence to us that we're going to grow up and predeterminedly become a certain type of human based off of just our biology. And so Freud developed the psychosexual stages to address this, and a condition that he called polymorphous perversity, where humans are born without sexuality or gender. And so these are things that, rather than coming fully packaged in your deal of welcome to being a human and welcome to the planet, these are things that we have to learn. And for Freud, specifically, unconsciously learn. So this is not necessarily a process where you're thinking about you growing up while you're growing up and considering what kind of human am I going to be? What kind of anxieties or neuroses I'm going to, integrate into myself? That these are all mostly going to be addressed in the unconscious. And it's going to matter, some very subtle things are going to matter here in terms of what counts and what doesn't count. All right, everyone, clutch your pearls because we're going to dive into the stages now. Stage 1, oral. So the oral stage occurs between birth and about 18 months. So we're looking at a period where the mouth is going to be the primary erogenous zone. So this is where pleasure is going to be fixated, specifically when it comes to breastfeeding and the chemical and emotional connections that one makes with their mother through this period. So with the oral stage, there's two major concerns that we have here. The first one are babies who are overfed and babies who are underfed. And so if we don't hit that happy mean where children get the right amount of nutrition and sustenance and comforting, whereas we're not neglecting them and we're not spoiling them, for example, then we can carry on and become normal human beings. But if we're overfed or underfed, then this is what Freud calls an oral fixation. So oral fixations, people with oral fixations tend to be a little bit more manipulative of other people when it comes to, I thought there was a mosquito because it's apparently summer today in Texas. It was very cold earlier. So the major concern here is with oral fixated people is that they're going to be a little bit more manipulative of others to gain resources and protection. So rather than becoming independent, they're rather toxically interdependent, and they don't quite have the survive on your own instinct available. Now, because this is a modernist theory, and modernist theories were birthed in the 20th century, the oral stage can be marked by the psychoanalyst as people who are too talkative, people who smoke, people who bite their nails, chew their pins, and any oral sexual practices. Because remember, in this Victorian age, in this modernist age, Anything other than just your basic heterosexual missionary position for the sole purpose of reproduction is going to be frowned upon, not just by religious people, but also by scientists and lawyers and medical professionals, the whole gambit. They are against anything beyond just procreative sex only. So for Freud, if somebody has an oral fixation, they're also going to exhibit some of the neuroses of oral sex. So you have your analingus, your cunnilingus, and your fellatio, which is mouth to anus, mouth to vulva, and mouth to penis, respectively. Next, we move on to the anal stage. So the anal stage picks right up off of the oral stage. So we're moving our erogenous zone from our mouth to our butts. And this is going to be from 18 months to about 3 years old, or however long it takes the potty training period, because that's going to be the major milestone here. So with the anal stage, we're mostly focused not so much in pleasure around the anus, as much as we are in control. Specifically, one's bodily control and the control that other people exert onto your body. And so, prior to potty training, you're living out in your natural life. You can just, poop wherever you want because it goes into a diaper and people take care of it and you don't have to take responsibility for your own shit. So, we have to start training little humans how to take care of their own stuff. And adults are the parent or a caregiver is going to be the primary mode in which the foundation of this control, both in terms of authority controlling the individual and the individual controlling their body, takes place. And this happens during the potty training years. So if we're looking at a parent who has very relaxed rules, they don't really care, they're not particularly disciplinary, they don't really have any they'll figure out when they figure it out, then you're going to have, according to Freud, children who grow up to be anal expulsive. So these people are going to have some personality traits that are a little bit reckless, a little bit excessive. They're not very good at cleaning up after themselves or taking responsibility for their problems. They can be very messy. And so with this stage, if the parents are not able to exert a respect for and above authority on the individual to their body, then you're going to start having some carelessness take over. Now, on the opposite end, you could have anal retentive people whose parents were very heavy-handed and very punitive when it comes to the potty training process. And there could have been a lot of guilt or shame involved in this as well. And so that individual, Freud says, is going to grow up and develop into an anal retentive, which are going to be hyper-focused on details. This is where you get jokes when someone's like, oh yeah, no, they're so anal, blah, blah, blah. Well, anal refers to this stage where people develop anal retentiveness. They get very OCD about tasks, and they tend to be perfectionists and tend to freak out when things go wrong or if things aren't neatly in order. They like their boxes. Let's talk about the phallic stage. Now, the phallic stage happens after the anal stage. So we're assuming that the child has become, toilet trained. And now we've moved on to the next stage where they start to recognize the differences and similarities between their genitals, their parents, and their peers, perhaps siblings, animals like pets or something like that. And they start to recognize that humans can be roughly categorized into two different groups. Now, when we get older, we learn about intersex, and we learn that the relationship between our genitals and our gender identity is not necessarily equal all the time. That's not a one-to-one ratio. But for kids, we're looking at some more primitive knowledge structures, and they're just getting used to developing categories to begin with. So we start to notice differences between boys and girls, roughly, according to Freud. And this is where we start getting gender identity developing. So boys start to notice that they're physiologically similar to their fathers, and so they start to identify with that male role model. Similarly, girls to their moms, etc. And if you don't have a mom or a dad in this scenario, then the next adult of that gender usually takes place for them, in Freud's mind at least. Now, with this stage, it does come with a little bit of anxiety. So as we start to notice these differences, according to Freud, boys and girls start to develop what he called either the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex. So not only are we starting to understand gender and gender categories, but we're also kind of starting to understand our sexual orientations as well. And so for the Oedipus complex, for example, Freud argued that boys start to develop sexual feelings and attractions towards their mothers, and they start getting very defensive towards their mothers, and they start to realize that dad is more of a competitor who would probably kill them if they found out that, their son was also chasing their wife. So there starts to become this big anxiety here where they want the mother, but they can't have the mother because their dad's going to kill them. And so if you can't beat them, you join them. And so the resolution of the Oedipus complex is for boys to take their sexual drives off of their mother and start to identify with their fathers, so that way they can then replicate that same heterosexual behavior onto another woman rather than their mother. Similarly with the Electra complex, Freud argued that for girls they can't really lust after their mothers because they don't have penises. It's Freud, man. We just go with it. Like, we don't take it seriously. We just go with it. And so they start to have sexual imaginings about their father because he has the penis that they do not have, and then they can transfer that sort of heterosexual energy onto other boys when they realize that their mother is a competitor, and will likely kill them if they find out that they're also lusting after her husband. So we get a little bit incestuous here. This is why Freud gets a bad rap. But rest assured, we're not really dealing with Oedipus complexes or Electra complexes in psychology today. This is more of a historical novelty. One thing that we can pull out of this, however, is the social learning aspect of both gender and sexuality here. So it's not so much that you have this explicit sexual fantasizing about your parents or this fear or anxiety about your parents. This is mostly happening in the unconscious level. So we're not really concerned about children actively thinking about sex and gender things during this period. Yeah, they're trying to figure it out, but they're not quite ideological in the way that adults are. And so this argument that we develop our gender and sexuality socially and unconsciously is something that I think has remained from Freud, but we've definitely moved far away from the whole lusting after your parents deal. All right, so what happens after we get out of this stage? Well, about 7 years old, we get to the latency stage, and this occurs up until about puberty. And so with the latency stage, kids, arguably, fair, Freud says that they freak out because of this whole gender, sexuality thing. They're not about it. They decide to nope out of this process for as long as they possibly can. Now, in this stage, you start to see gendered play occurring. So girls will move in with girl circles in elementary school, junior high. Boys will go into boy circles. And we start to see gender segregation happening here. This is also the stage where girls have cooties, for example, starts to emerge. So boys and girls are very much repulsed by the idea of sex and romance at this stage. So according to Freud, after they get done lusting after their parents, they freak out, have a coming to Jesus moment, and they decide sex is now off the table. We're only going to run in our same gendered circles, and that's going to be that because girls are gross and boys are mean, and we're just going to be friends forever. Until puberty happens. And then when puberty happens, everything gets thrown out the window. So we get to puberty, and this is where we hit our genital stage, so our fifth and final stage of the psychosexual stages. And this is where our newly found teenagers who have sworn off sex and romance are now going, oh, I actually like the opposite sex, if they've made it through the sexual stages successfully. If they have any breaks during this period, then Freud says we start getting some gender dysmorphia. People become more fixated on sexual interactions with the same sex. Oh my God, the gays! And we start to see personality defects occurring as well. So assuming you've moved through the psychosexual stages successfully and you're an upstanding heterosexual citizen, you will then decide sex is your deal and you're going to start pursuing romantic relationships with the opposite sex as yourself. And this really closes out because this is where the stages end. If you are a college student, if you're in my class, if you're anyone above the age of 18, for example, really if you've already hit puberty, which should be most of the people who watch this, we are all in the genital stage until we die. So this is the stage where our goals are to mate, have babies, have successful familial friendship and romantic relationships. Sorry, I thought there was a mosquito on my leg. There probably was, because it's starting to get dark now. And that's really going to close out the psychosexual stages. A couple things that I want to touch on briefly. Some of the jokes that come out of Freud. So Freud was a big cultural influence, so not just in terms of jokes, but also in terms of folk psychology. So folk psychology is things that people who aren't psychologists believe about human behavior. So if you want to rewind and think about our conversation about the gays, for example, one of the major stereotypes, I guess, or one of the major folk theories about why people are gay is that they had a absentee father and an over repressive mother who was always in their business or whatever. And this kind of gets at that Oedipus complex where if you don't have a father to fear, for example, then you may not identify with him or his gender, and then things get mixed up in that Oedipus complex. And so there are some long-standing folk psychology beliefs, particularly like the idea that women only date men who remind them of their fathers. This comes out of this Freudian psychosexual stage theory too. Perhaps this idea that you need some sort of trauma, for example, to be gay or transgender, probably comes out of the psychosexual stages as well, because if you're healthy, if nothing goes wrong, if your parents were great, then you should skate right along through these stages and become an upstanding heterosexual cisgendered adult. And if anything happens, like trauma or divorce or poverty or any sort of deviancy occurring in childhood, or if your parents weren't the right way, then all of a sudden they're going to spit out some gay transgender babies, which is not the case at all. And so that's also one of the folk psychology theories that come out of this as well, is that parents who mess up are responsible for having gay children. Gay children are not a punishment to parents. So this is going to wrap up our discussion on the psychosexual stages. I want to just give some props to Sigmund Freud, first of all. This was one of the first coherent theories about sexual gender development, and it happened to also coincide with a personality development theory as well, so he got all three mixed up into the same batch, which impressive. I want to give props to Freud for coming up with polymorphous perversity, this idea that our gender and sex is a learned process that we have to grow into rather than be born into. For example, that one seems to hold up. And, just with all of the more taboo subjects about Freud, generally it's going to, freak anybody out and make them clutch their pearls. So take Freud with a grain of salt, but do appreciate the foundation that he built. And just because we can, pick out the good things and leave the rest behind, that's not a bad thing. We do not have to fully endorse Freud in order to use Freud's ideas. So thank you so much for tuning in. I will see you in the next video, perhaps. Let's see how this goes. Do you like my quarantine beard?